The Dodge Challenger sat alone at the edge of the Kingsley Performance Center, half buried in dust, a faded red tag taped to its windshield that read "Scrap before 6 p.m." The CEO of Kingsley Automotive, Sloan Kingsley, walked past it without slowing down, dismissing it as a worthless shell taking up valuable floor space. Beside her stood Cole Barrett, a contract mechanic in a stained jumpsuit, the kind of man nobody in that building bothered to remember by name. He asked for 10 more minutes before the car was hauled to the crusher, and the request was met with a short, dismissive laugh from the floor supervisor standing nearby. Sloan gave the order anyway, telling the crew to chain it up and move it along with the rest of the discarded inventory. But when Cole knelt beside the rear cargo panel and ran his hand along a seam that did not belong on a factory build, he felt his pulse change. Hidden behind that panel was a titanium case stamped with the signature of the company's late founder, and inside it waited something that could either save Kingsley Automotive or bury it for good. Years earlier, the man who had built this company from nothing had hidden a secret inside this very vehicle, and nobody left alive in that building had any idea it was still there. The liquidation crew moved through the facility with clipboards and barcode scanners, treating each piece of equipment as nothing more than a line item to be priced, tagged, and hauled away before the quarter closed its books. Nobody paused long enough to ask why a single vehicle, tucked away from the rest of the inventory, had been excluded from the standard resale list rather than simply marked for auction like everything else around it. That detail alone should have raised questions, but in a building being dismantled piece by piece, questions were a luxury nobody on the clock could afford to ask. The facility outside Detroit had once buzzed with engineers chasing breakthroughs nobody else dared to attempt, and now it sat half empty, its machines tagged for auction, its history treated like clutter. Hundreds of vehicles and pieces of equipment were lined up for liquidation that week, each one assigned a number, a price, and an expiration date. The Challenger had been pushed into a far corner, away from the newer prototypes, as though someone wanted it forgotten rather than simply sold. Its body was coated in years of dust, its rear bumper dented, its electronics completely dark, and its serial number had already been struck from the list of vehicles eligible for resale. Reed Halston, the company's polished and soft-spoken executive vice president, walked the floor with Sloan that morning, explaining that the car had once belonged to a failed internal project and carried legal risk the company could no longer afford. He urged her to have it destroyed before the end of the day, framing it as a simple matter of liability and nothing more. Cole noticed something the others missed, a small symbol etched discreetly into the rear support bar, 3 diagonal lines inside a circle. It was not a manufacturer's mark, and it was not something any ordinary technician would recognize. But Cole had seen it before, years earlier, stamped on classified hardware inside a research lab that no longer officially existed. He asked the floor supervisor for permission to inspect the vehicle further, and the man barely looked up from his clipboard before telling him he had been hired to strip parts, not rescue dead cars. Cole did not argue. He simply stood there a moment longer, staring at the car the way a person stares at an old photograph they were not expecting to find. Something about the welds beneath the chassis told him this was not an abandoned project at all, but something deliberately concealed. As the crew prepared the tow chains, he whispered to himself that whoever left this car here never intended for it to be crushed, and that quiet certainty would not leave him for the rest of the day. Cole tried again later that morning to flag his discovery to a site manager, but his personnel file listed him only as a temporary mechanic, with no mention of the engineering career he once had. Reed happened to pass through the warehouse at that exact moment, and something in his expression flickered when he heard the name Barrett, though he quickly masked it behind practiced indifference. Loud enough for several technicians to hear, Reed asked whether a parts stripper was now lecturing the company on asset management, and the room responded with the kind of laughter that exists specifically to humiliate someone quietly. Sloan overheard the exchange and walked over, offering Cole exactly 30 seconds to explain himself before she returned to more important matters. He told her the car weighed more than its factory specifications allowed, that the rear cargo wall had clearly been reinforced, that a wiring harness ran into a space absent from any standard diagram, and that the welding technique matched a defunct internal lab rather than an assembly line. Sloan asked for proof, and Cole admitted he could not access the hidden section without removing part of the interior first, requesting only 10 minutes to do so. Reed jumped in immediately, insisting every additional minute cost the company money and exposed them to greater liability, and Sloan, trusting her longtime advisor over a man she had never met, sided with him without hesitation. She told Cole flatly that better engineers than him had already evaluated this vehicle years ago and found nothing worth saving, and the words landed exactly as she intended them to. Cole did not raise his voice or argue back. He simply said that those engineers may never have been permitted to see the part of the car he was talking about, and for one brief second, something behind Reed's composed expression cracked. Before security could escort him fully away from the bay, Cole received a short phone call from his 11-year-old daughter, Avery, reminding him he had promised to fix her late mother's old radio that evening. He told her he would be home in time, and the brief exchange revealed something important about the man standing in that warehouse, a single father who was not chasing recognition or revenge, only trying to finish an honest day's work and return home to his daughter. As the tow cable tightened around the Challenger's frame and the car began to roll toward the lift, its long-dead electronics suddenly produced a single weak beep, and a faint string of letters flickered briefly across the dashboard display. 2 words appeared and then vanished just as quickly, but not before several people in the room had seen them clearly. C. Barrett. Every person standing near the vehicle turned to look at Cole at once, and Sloan demanded an explanation for why his name had just surfaced on a company-owned car he claimed never to have worked on. Cole admitted, carefully and without embellishment, that he had once worked at Kingsley Advanced Systems years earlier, contributing to an experimental thermal control system before leaving abruptly when his wife became seriously ill. When he later tried to reach back out to the company, he found his name had vanished from every internal record he once had access to. Reed wasted no time correcting the narrative, claiming Cole had actually been a low-level technician dismissed for violating security protocol, a story delivered with such smooth confidence that several onlookers nodded along without question. Cole chose not to argue, knowing he had no documentation yet to support his version of events, and Sloan pulled up the employee archive on her tablet to settle the matter herself. The record did list a Cole Barrett, but his listed title read only shop support, a designation that seemed to confirm exactly what Reed had said, and it pushed Sloan further toward trusting her advisor over the stranger standing in front of her. Reed pressed his advantage and ordered the battery disconnected so the vehicle could continue toward the crusher without further delay, and Cole stepped quietly in front of the car, not with aggression but with the stillness of a man who refused to move. He told Sloan that if she destroyed this vehicle, she would not simply be discarding scrap metal, she would be destroying something her own father had once fought to protect. The mention of Elias Kingsley struck a nerve neither of them expected, and Sloan's expression hardened into something colder than annoyance, convinced Cole was exploiting her late father's memory to manufacture sympathy. She ordered security to remove him from the premises immediately, and as 2 guards stepped forward, Cole heard a faint relay click somewhere behind the rear seats, a sound that told him the hidden system inside still had its own independent power source. Before he was pulled away, he tossed a small worn metal ring toward the trunk, an old identification token from a project most people in that building had long forgotten existed. The vehicle responded with 3 distinct beeps, confirming what Cole already suspected, that this Challenger had never truly been abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to return. Mara Whitcomb, the company's legal counsel, noticed the unusual electronic response and quietly advised Sloan to pause the destruction order before they risked damaging evidence that legally still belonged to the corporation. She had spent enough years inside this building to know that destroyed property could never be undestroyed, and that a single rash decision made under time pressure had a way of becoming a permanent and expensive mistake. Reed objected far more forcefully than the situation warranted, and that overreaction was the first crack in Sloane's confidence, a flicker of doubt she could not quite explain. She looked at Reed for a long moment, then turned and granted Cole exactly 10 minutes, warning him plainly that the car would still be crushed the second that window closed. A small digital timer was placed on a nearby workbench, counting down in plain view of everyone in the bay, and Reed insisted every action Cole took be recorded on camera to prevent any kind of tampering. The countdown ticked steadily downward while a small crowd gathered to watch, some out of genuine curiosity, others simply hoping to see a stranger fail in front of the executives who mattered most to their own careers. Cole worked quickly but methodically, removing the cargo liner, the rear speaker assembly, and a layer of sound insulation that had clearly been added long after the vehicle left the factory. Beneath it all, he found 4 bolts using a fastener size that none of the standard tool sets in the warehouse could match, and for a moment, laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to watch him fail. Reed continued calling out the remaining minutes with obvious satisfaction. Certain Cole's claims were about to collapse in front of everyone, but Cole reached for a small custom bit attached to his own keyring rather than the warehouse toolbox. It fit the unusual bolt heads perfectly, and he explained, without defensiveness, that Elias Kingsley had once required his research team to use proprietary fasteners specifically to keep outsiders from accessing this section of the vehicle. Sloan asked why a contract mechanic would still be carrying a tool tied to her father's private research program after all these years, and Reed suggested aloud that it might constitute theft of company property. Cole answered calmly that Elias had personally handed him that exact on the final day the project operated, and Reed responded with a cutting remark, noting how convenient it was that the only person who could confirm that story was no longer alive to do so. Cole did not rise to the insult. He kept working, and with less than 90 seconds remaining on the timer, the rear panel still refused to budge through force alone, prompting him to realize the locking mechanism responded to a sequence rather than simple pressure. He connected a small auxiliary power source, pressed the ignition switch 3 times in succession, held the brake firmly in place, turned a hidden climate control dial to its lowest setting, and finally pressed the worn identification ring against a concealed sensor near the seam. A mechanical latch released with an audible click, and the rear cargo wall slowly swung open to reveal a precisely engineered compartment that had never appeared on any factory blueprint. The space inside looked nothing like the rest of the vehicle. Clean edges, custom brackets, wiring routed with the kind of deliberate care that only came from someone building a system meant to survive years of neglect rather than a quick afternoon repair job. Inside sat a sealed titanium case, dark and unmarked except for a single engraved line across its lid, Project Sentinel, followed by the names E. Kingsley and C. Burrett side by side. The people who had been laughing only moments earlier fell completely silent, and Sloan stepped closer, staring at her father's name, etched permanently beside the man she had just spent the morning dismissing. Reed immediately insisted nobody touch the case, citing vague security concerns that suddenly sounded far less convincing than they had only minutes before. Cole looked directly at him and said quietly that Reed wasn't worried the contents were dangerous. He was worried because he already knew exactly what they were. Mara documented the discovery and established a formal chain of custody before allowing the case to be moved into a secured technical conference room equipped with its own camera system. Using the identification ring and a numeric sequence known only to those who had worked on the original project, Cole opened the case to reveal a sealed core module, a fire-resistant storage drive, a handwritten envelope addressed in Elias Kingsley's own writing, a set of sensors removed after the project's final test run, and a small standalone video player. Sloane activated the device, and her late father's face appeared on the screen for the first time in years, explaining in a steady voice that someone inside the company's leadership had deliberately sabotaged Project Sentinel before he could identify every person responsible. Believing he might not have time left to finish the investigation himself, he had hidden the prototype and its supporting data inside the Challenger, instructing that whoever eventually found the vehicle was to hand everything directly to Cole Barrett, and to trust no conclusions about the project that did not include him. Sloane sat frozen, hearing her father speak a name she had mocked only hours earlier with open contempt, and she asked Cole quietly why he had never once tried to find her personally over the years that followed. Cole explained, without bitterness, that after his wife passed away, he had written to the company repeatedly seeking answers, only to have every letter returned unanswered. His name had quietly been placed on an informal list that kept him from being hired by several partner firms in the industry, and without the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle, he had taken whatever work he could find to provide for his daughter, choosing stability over a fight he could not afford to lose. Reed argued the recovered footage could easily have been altered, suggesting the entire case and its contents be transferred immediately to a security team under his own direct control. He spoke with the same unhurried confidence he always carried into difficult rooms, the tone of a man who had spent decades learning that calm words traveled further than panicked ones ever could. It was a tactic that had worked on this board many times before, and for a moment it seemed likely to work again, until Mara quietly reminded everyone present exactly whose signature appeared on the order that had shut the original research division down in the first place. Mara refused outright, pointing out that Reed himself had approved the closure of the original research division years earlier, creating an obvious conflict of interest that disqualified him from overseeing the evidence. For the first time that day, Sloane sided publicly against her longtime advisor, choosing instead to keep the discovery under independent legal supervision. When technicians attempted to access the encrypted storage drive, the system required two separate authentication keys, one belonging to Elias Kingsley and the other tied specifically to Cole's own biometric signature, confirming beyond doubt that his role in this project had been far more significant than any personnel file had ever recorded. The recovered data revealed thousands of hours of legitimate testing, proving the Sentinel system had functioned exactly as intended, but a separate folder labeled Final Failure told a very different story. Timestamps, calibration logs, and sensor readouts filled screen after screen, the kind of dense technical record that meant nothing to most of the people in the room, but read like a confession to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Internal access logs showed that the thermal sensors had been deliberately swapped out shortly before the project's final demonstration in front of the board of directors years earlier, an act that had directly caused the very failure used to justify shutting the entire program down. The approval signature attached to that sensor replacement belonged to one person, and the name displayed clearly across the screen sent a wave of stunned silence through the room. Reed Halston. Rather than panicking or attempting to flee the building, Reed remained composed, calmly insisting the digital signature had been forged and could not be trusted as evidence. He pivoted quickly into attacking Cole's credibility instead, suggesting he had a personal motive for revenge, that he had once accepted a severance payment upon leaving the company, that he had improperly retained a restricted security tool, and that he had missed the project's final critical test session entirely. Cole confirmed quietly that he had indeed been absent that day, explaining without shame that his wife had been rushed to the emergency room that exact afternoon, a fact Reed twisted into a portrait of an unreliable engineer rather than a grieving husband doing everything he could to hold his family together. Several board members in the room began visibly leaning toward Reed's version of events, less interested in technical truth than in the simple optics of a man in a stained work uniform challenging a wealthy, well-dressed executive. Security was instructed to remove Cole from the room while the company independently verified the new data, and Sloan, caught between fresh evidence and years of trust built with her father's closest advisor, found herself unable to fully commit to either side. That evening, Cole returned to his small house carrying his toolbox, but never touching the radio he had promised Avery he would repair. The house was quiet in the way it always was after a long shift, dishes still in the sink, a single lamp burning in the living room, the kind of ordinary stillness that made the chaos of the day feel almost unreal by comparison. When she asked what was wrong, he admitted he had finally been given a chance to reclaim the career and reputation stolen from him years earlier, but that doing so might cost him the only job he currently had to support them both. Avery offered no grand wisdom, only a simple observation rooted in her mother's old habit of plain speaking, telling him that her mother always said he never fixed anything by pretending it wasn't broken. That small, unguarded sentence settled something in Cole that hours of corporate pressure had failed to shake, and he resolved, quietly and firmly, that he would not stay silent any longer. Under cover of darkness, Reed arranged to have the Challenger quietly relocated to another facility under the pretense of protecting company assets. But Mara discovered the transfer order had never actually been approved by Sloan. Cole understood almost immediately what Reed's true intention was, recognizing that destroying the data itself was unnecessary if he could simply damage the physical prototype and later claim the recovered information was impossible to verify. Cole, Mara, and Sloan rushed to the transport yard together and arrived just before the vehicle could be moved off-site, and rather than any physical confrontation, Sloan simply exercised her authority as chief executive and halted the order on the spot. For the first time since the discovery began, she turned to Cole and asked for his help directly, rather than issuing instructions from a position of assumed superiority, inquiring whether he could prove the system had truly worked the way the recovered footage claimed. Cole answered that the question wasn't whether it had once worked, but whether it could still work now, today, in front of everyone who doubted it. With that, he proposed restoring the Challenger and recreating the exact test that Reed had sabotaged 4 years earlier, giving them only until the following morning's board meeting to make it happen. Cole was granted use of the old research bay for a single night, and rather than working alone in some unrealistic feat of solo heroics, Sloan personally reached out to several technicians who had been part of the original Sentinel project. Phone calls went out well past midnight, and one by one, cars began pulling into the lot outside, headlights cutting through the dark as people who had not spoken to each other in years arrived without complaint, drawn back by little more than a sense that something unfinished was finally being given a chance to be finished properly. An electrical specialist, a software engineer, a metal fabricator, and a data systems technician arrived within the hour, several of them visibly stunned to see Cole standing there, having long believed he was the reason the project had collapsed in the first place. Cole did not waste time correcting old assumptions or defending his past. He simply assigned clear responsibilities and focused everyone's attention on the vehicle itself, treating the team the way a leader treats people he trusts rather than people who once doubted him. The group quickly identified several serious problems, including degraded fuel lines from years of neglect, a deliberately severed primary electrical circuit, software locked remotely from an external account, and counterfeit sensors still sitting inside the engine compartment exactly where they had been planted years before. Cole carefully removed the false components and replaced them with the original sensors recovered from inside the titanium case, then began restoring the calibration data pulled directly from the encrypted drive. Sloan watched quietly as the technicians fell into step around Cole without hesitation, following his instructions the way professionals follow someone whose competence speaks louder than any job title ever could. She began to understand, perhaps for the first time, how little a personnel file's wording actually reflected a person's real ability or worth. In a rare, quiet moment between tasks, Sloan admitted that she had once viewed her father's research division as an indulgent waste of company resources, having been convinced over the years by Reed that Project Sentinel had become an unhealthy obsession that clouded her father's judgment. Cole did not offer her easy comfort or false reassurance. He told her plainly that Reed had lied to her, but that she was the one who had chosen never to verify it for herself, a statement she accepted without argument or defense. It marked an important shift between them, the moment Sloan stopped treating Cole as a subordinate to be managed and started treating him as someone whose judgment deserved genuine respect. That same night, Mara uncovered a shell company called Halston Strategic Holdings quietly preparing to acquire the very thermal management patents tied to Sentinel, once Kingsley formally abandoned the project, along with banking records showing Reed had been negotiating separately with a rival manufacturer named Crestmont Automotive. The full scope of Reed's plan became unmistakable once laid out in order. Sabotage the project from within, force the closure of the research division, ensure the final prototype was destroyed beyond recovery, acquire the underlying intellectual property for almost nothing through his shell company, and finally sell that same technology to a direct competitor for enormous personal profit. It was a plan built patiently over years, hidden behind polished suits and quiet boardroom language, the kind of scheme that depended entirely on nobody ever bothering to look closely enough to see it. As dawn approached and the team prepared for a final ignition test, the Challenger's engine roared to life briefly before a sudden red thermal warning flashed across the dashboard, and the system shut itself down without warning. Panic spread quickly through the room, with several technicians fearing the core module had been damaged beyond repair after everything they had just accomplished. Cole pulled up the diagnostic data and noticed almost immediately that the warning hadn't originated from the Sentinel core at all, but from the company's own external monitoring software layered on top of it. He traced the alert backward through line after line of code, ignoring the rising tension around him, focused entirely on the simple question of where exactly this command had originated and who had been given the authority to write it. Buried within that software was a hidden command programmed to automatically shut the system down the instant it reached full operational capacity, a kill switch installed years earlier under an administrative account that traced directly back to Reed Halston himself. Rather than deleting the malicious code immediately, Cole carefully backed up every trace of it, documenting the entire discovery to preserve it as evidence rather than simply erasing the problem. Once Mara confirmed the finding and secured copies of the data, the team disabled the sabotage code and attempted the ignition sequence once more, this time without interference. The Challenger's engine started cleanly and held steady, its temperatures regulated precisely, its power distribution behaving exactly as the original test data had promised it would years earlier. By morning, the board of directors had gathered at the facility's test track, and Reed arrived alongside his own personal attorney, immediately accusing Sloan of endangering the entire company by placing her trust in what he called a disgruntled mechanic with a personal grudge. Standing in front of the assembled board, he mocked Cole openly, insisting that a car simply starting did not make the man behind it an engineer, and certainly did not make his story true. Cole did not respond with words. Instead, he laid out everything methodically in front of the board. The counterfeit sensors recovered from the engine bay, the falsified access logs bearing Reed's own credentials, the hidden shutdown code traced back to his administrative account, the original verified test data from years earlier, the shell company paperwork connecting him to a direct competitor, and finally, the recorded message left behind by Elias Kingsley himself. He spoke without theatrics, laying each piece of evidence on the table the same way he once laid out tools before beginning a repair, in order, without wasted motion, each item building toward a conclusion that no longer needed him to argue it out loud. Mara confirmed that every piece of evidence had been independently verified through proper legal channels, leaving no room for the kind of doubt Reed had relied on throughout the entire ordeal. Sloan announced Reed's immediate suspension and ordered the complete case file turned over to financial investigators, ending any chance he had of talking his way out of what the evidence had already proven. When he attempted to shift blame onto subordinates who had supposedly acted without his knowledge, archived security footage surfaced showing Reed himself entering the original research bay the night before the very test he had sabotaged years before. The same board members who had laughed at Cole only a day earlier now sat in silence, unable to meet his eyes. Sloan offered Cole a seat at the head of the table to formally present his findings, but he did not take it right away. He looked instead toward the manager who had once called him nothing more than a parts stripper, and told the room plainly that he didn't need a chair to prove he understood this vehicle, but that the people who had actually built it deserved to have their names recorded correctly. He requested that every member of the original technical team have their reputations and records restored, not himself alone, insisting their contributions had been buried alongside his own for far too long. With the corporate confrontation resolved on paper, one critical question still remained unanswered in front of the partners watching closely from the sidelines: whether the Sentinel system could actually perform under real, sustained pressure on an open track, because if it failed now, the sabotage evidence would still hold weight, but the licensing deal capable of saving the entire automotive division would be lost for good. Cole climbed behind the wheel of the Challenger for the formal test run, with Sloan choosing to sit beside him in the passenger seat, rather than observe safely from a distance, a clear signal that she was prepared to share responsibility for whatever happened next. The test sequence pushed the vehicle through sustained acceleration, simulated high heat conditions, abrupt load transfers, emergency braking, and a forced restart while the system was still running hot, each phase displayed in real time on monitors for both the board and the watching licensing partners. Early into the run, temperatures climbed faster than anyone in the room felt comfortable with, drawing audible tension from several onlookers who had already begun to doubt the outcome. Then the Sentinel core engaged fully, and the temperature curve on every screen began to fall and stabilize almost immediately, exactly as the recovered historical data had once promised it would. The Challenger completed the entire test sequence without a single failure, finishing the very trial that had been deliberately destroyed 4 years earlier under Reed's direction. Representatives from the licensing partner confirmed on the spot that the technology now met every requirement necessary to reopen formal negotiations, a deal substantial enough to save the research division, protect hundreds of jobs across the company, prevent the automotive segment from being sold off entirely, and finally restore the reputation Elias Kingsley had spent his final years trying to protect. Numbers were mentioned in the conversations that followed. Contract values large enough to rebuild an entire division from the ground up, but none of it carried the same weight in that moment as the simple sight of an engine running exactly the way it had once been designed to run, 4 years and a great deal of buried truth later than it should have. When the car finally rolled to a stop, nobody applauded right away. A heavy silence settled over the track instead, the kind that comes when a room realizes it has just witnessed a long-buried truth come back to life in front of them. It was the original technicians, the ones who had quietly followed Cole through that single overnight restoration, who began clapping first, and the sound slowly spread through the rest of the crowd. Sloan stepped out of the car and stood before the full staff gathered at the facility, publicly admitting that she had judged Cole based on his uniform and his job title rather than the truth in front of her, and that she had trusted polished reports over verified facts for far too long. She acknowledged openly that she had nearly destroyed the last surviving piece of her father's legacy, and that Cole owed the company nothing in the way of forgiveness for how he had been treated. Turning to face him directly, she admitted she had once called this very vehicle worthless, and had treated the one person capable of saving it as though his voice didn't matter at all. Cole did not use the moment to embarrass her further. He simply told her that the best way forward was to make certain the next person who walked through those doors never had to fight this hard just to be heard. In the days that followed, the board offered Cole a substantial financial settlement in exchange for quietly signing away his rights connected to the Sentinel project. But he refused to sign anything immediately, choosing instead to set his own conditions before agreeing to anything at all. He insisted that every member of the original technical team have their names and contributions formally restored within company records, that anyone wrongfully dismissed during the project's collapse be offered the chance to return, that all future safety data be subject to independent oversight, that Reed and anyone connected to his scheme be barred from quietly negotiating their way out of consequences, and that the technology never be rushed into marketing before its testing was fully and properly completed. The board, fully aware that Cole held verified co-ownership rights personally confirmed by Elias Kingsley himself, reluctantly agreed to every condition he set. There was no further negotiation, no attempt to talk him down to something smaller, only quiet signatures from people who understood they had already lost whatever leverage they once believed they held over him. Sloan went further still, offering Cole the newly created position of Director of Prototype Recovery and Development at Kingsley Advanced Systems, a role that came with far more than a title alone. He was given the authority to build his own engineering team, a meaningful equity stake in the project's future success, a working schedule that respected his responsibilities as a single father, direct reporting access to the chief executive herself, and full authority to refuse releasing any product he believed was not genuinely safe. When Cole asked why she had chosen to trust him so completely after everything that had happened, Sloan answered simply that when he had every opportunity to humiliate the people who had dismissed him, he chose instead to protect the very people who had once failed to protect him. Reed was escorted from the facility shortly after to face the formal investigation now underway, with no dramatic confrontation, no pleading, and no violence required to close that chapter. He walked out flanked by 2 security officers, his expression composed to the very end, the same careful mask he had worn through every meeting, every lie, and every quiet manipulation of the last 4 years. His harshest punishment came quietly in the simple act of walking past the fully restored Challenger running on the test track outside, the very machine he had spent 4 years trying to erase from existence entirely. Several months later, Kingsley Advanced Systems reopened its doors to the public for the first time since the project's collapse, and the Challenger stood at the center of it, fully restored but never reduced to a static display piece behind glass. The building itself had changed in small but meaningful ways. New equipment installed beside the old, a younger generation of engineers walking the same floors where Cole had once been told he didn't belong, and a quiet but firm policy now in place requiring every contributor's name to be recorded accurately from the very first day of any project going forward. It continued serving exactly the purpose Elias and Cole had originally intended for it, as a working prototype rather than a museum relic admired from a safe distance. A small plaque inside the research bay listed the names of every engineer who had contributed to the original project, with Cole's name appearing no larger or more prominent than anyone else's beside it. Avery visited the facility during its internal opening day, watching her father move through the space wearing an engineer's uniform that finally bore his actual name instead of the nameless work clothes she had grown used to seeing him in. She walked slowly past the workbenches and the gleaming equipment, taking in a version of her father's world she had never been allowed to see before, one that finally matched the quiet competence she had always known he carried at home. She asked him quietly whether this was truly the car nobody had wanted, and Cole told her no, this was the car too many people had wanted to make disappear entirely. Sloan personally handed Avery her late grandmother's old radio, fully repaired with a small custom part the research team had fabricated themselves, quietly closing the loop on the simple promise Cole had made at the very beginning of this entire ordeal. Sloan placed the Challenger's keys directly into Cole's hand, telling him plainly that while the vehicle now officially belonged to the project as a whole, the first person to drive it back out onto the open road needed to be him. Cole settled into the driver's seat one final time, with Avery standing safely off to the side, surrounded by the technical team that had rebuilt this machine together overnight, and Sloan took the passenger seat beside him, not as a chief executive issuing orders, but as a genuine partner in the work that lay ahead. The engine turned over smoothly, steady and sure, and across the dashboard display, 4 simple words appeared in clean, glowing text. "Welcome back, C. Barrett." The Challenger pulled away from the research bay and out into the early morning light, leaving behind every doubt, every dismissal, and every closed door that had once stood in its way. The very car that had been marked for destruction before sunset on an ordinary afternoon had become something else entirely, a quiet reminder of a simple truth too often forgotten in places built on titles and appearances. Sometimes the thing everyone calls worthless is only waiting in the hands of someone who never had the chance or the courage to look closely enough to see what it was truly worth. If you found yourself rooting for Cole the moment he refused to back down, hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one when it arrives next.